Hey everyone, and welcome back to Creating Appealing Characters, Week 3. This week, the body. So, by this week, everyone should have a fairly decent block out of their character, with all the major shapes and forms explored for the most part. This week, we're really going to get focused on having our body sculpts well underway. And by the end of this week, you should have a fairly decent pass on the body, and the caricature of the design should be starting to come through. So previously, we started in ZBrush with a primitive, dynameshed that, and then sculpted out our figure piece by piece in order to control the shapes as we went along. I find that sometimes if you start with an existing topology, it can be pretty hard to get rid of all of the sculpting and specificity that goes into that base, especially if it was used on another character or pulled from another character. Speaking of character, I'm going to say that word a lot this week, because one of my lecture topics this week is what is character, not what is a character. So to me, character is the uniqueness that your design has over others. It's the personality that comes through and the empathy that you feel or don't that makes the design successful, or in our case, the interpretation of the design. So there's lots of ways to interpret designs that come across as the same character. And this week I want to talk about a couple of big concepts that are often mistaken for character or character design. And those concepts are style, anatomy, and costume design. So this week I'm hoping that you'll learn that these are tools that can contribute to your character, but none of these concepts in and of themselves are actually character design. And so hopefully you can recognize the difference between those things and realize when to use these tools and when to, or specifically not when to use these tools, but more how to control these tools. So here we have the Hulk. We've got the Hulk from Disney Infinity on the left and a Sideshow Collectibles sculpt of the Hulk on the right. And you can tell that the style is very different in these characters, but they feel very much like the same guy. There's a similar pose, which helps, the same coloring and all that stuff, but all that is pretty superficial because they're really communicating the same type of personality. I chose the Hulk as kind of a good example because he's so one-sided anyway, and so, he really only has rage as a personality trait, but look at how differently that emotion is communicated and how differently this character is represented across these two sculpts, but he comes across as the same guy. It's unmistakable. The point of this is that style does not dictate character. Shape language does not necessarily denote personality, and the same character can come through in a multitude of styles. Specific attributes that make the character who they are can carry through a design regardless of style. Let's talk a little bit about anatomy. So, anatomy also not specifically character design, but it's a great tool to help you ground your design, especially as you translate it into 3D. So if we take a look at my slide here, we've got this guy on the left, which you would never in a million years guess is Superman unless you were watching a movie titled Superman. He's just pretty much a muscle guy walking around. And I know it's a live action shot, but I think it makes my point. Now, over on the right, we've got a Bruce Timm drawing of Superman, and he's unmistakably Superman. Superman's design is very simplistic, and it's a good example of how you don't really need to add a ton of extra elements on top to help define who this character really is. So if we take that drawing and we strip away all of the things that make him Superman specifically, so I took out the color and I took the cape out and the emblems and stuff like that. I did a horrible hack job on this beautiful piece of art, but you can see how at its base it's just anatomy. It's just muscle guy again, and there's no real character there. Granted, the face is a huge part of any character, so taking that out removes, an immeasurable chunk of what really makes this character who he is. So anatomy, when used in a sculpt, it can be impressive to look at, and it's certainly useful, like I said, for grounding your design. But you want to use anatomy to support design elements, and don't just assign character to what is essentially an anatomy study. When making characters, you need more elements than just a body type, but those have to be the right elements. I want to mention also costume design as it relates to your character. So here is a page that I took straight from a Sam Nielsen blog that's essentially about the same thing. It's actually a great write-up if you go and read it, but it is all about how your character needs to shine through regardless of any sort of extra details or suits or costumes or anything that you put them into. The personality and life of your character should come across no matter what they are wearing. So we want to be able to, as we're working, get inside your character's head. I think that's always really helpful to start to think about what are they thinking? What are their intentions? That kind of stuff really helps you get inside the character. So as I mentioned before, the face is very important, eyes even more so, and we're going to get into that next week when we start on the face. So just a quick recap of that section. Style does not dictate character. Anatomy, great tool, but it's not in and of itself character design. And then costume design is obviously a huge part of making a character feel like it exists in a world or a setting, but your character needs to be able to shine through regardless of what they're wearing. Let's go over some quick terminology that I'm going to be saying a lot during this week's demo. Form, line, and break. So form. Form is the result of all the things that we're talking about. It's simply the visible shape of something. Line. So line, interior or exterior lines or silhouette lines. Lines are what describe the forms and the relationship between interior forms and exterior forms. Breaks or hits. That's a point at which a line or form transitions or changes direction. Here's an example. On the sculpt, if you take a look at the back silhouette here, we've got a very simple line that breaks at a certain point right there. That's where the line changes direction. That's where the whole form actually changes direction. If I go along the front contour, I've got a more complex side with a lot more breaks and form changes. So right here is a major point where that line turns from a concave to a convex line. We've got the apex of a curve. We've got the point where two simple swooping curves intersect and change the direction of the form, and another apex of a curve. Anatomy, like I said, very useful tool, and as such you should be using it as you're sculpting your body out. There's all kinds of great resources online. You can find tons of Bridgman books and Andrew Loomis books totally for free in PDF form online in their entirety. So look for that stuff and, use it when you're sculpting. I'm constantly referencing anatomy anytime I'm sculpting any body part, even if I'm doing something relatively simplistic. If you can get your hands on some Ray Bustos drawings, I find those to be really great. And also following like fitness people on Instagram and stuff like that. They love to take a lot of pictures of themselves, and seeing that sort of real world context outside of like a clinical anatomy book can be really informative. Another terminology piece that I want to talk about is edge quality. So when I talk about edge quality, I'm talking about hard and soft edges, usually defined by breaks in line and form. Here's a good example of what I mean. On this sketch that I started a while back, if we just take a look at the eye area, there's a crease underneath the eye that defines that socket line, and it moves from a relatively sharp creased edge to a smooth, very dissipated edge right there. So this is an important concept when it comes to sculpting, because obviously we don't want all of our edges to have the exact same amount of crease to them, and having your edge transition from sharp to soft as you go is going to make your sculpt feel more interesting and less mechanical. All right, well, I hope all that information is useful for you this week. Let's go ahead and jump right into ZBrush for the demo. Okay, so here we are back in ZBrush. I've got my spotlight image up here for reference, and this is where we left off last week with our sculpt. Just a basic block out of our character's major proportions. If you did a good job with your block out, you should be in a nice place for this week when we go and do our overall pass on this body. So let's just go ahead and jump right into the actual work of this week. The grouping of these body parts don't really concern me too much anymore. They've served their purposes. So I'm going to turn off the color on this real quick and just get a default gray. I like to work with just very simple or no color for a little while until I start to get the forms and things blocked in and working. All right, so just taking a cursory glance at this model from last week, there's a few things I might just want to kind of correct as far as proportion. And like I feel like these legs should be a little bit longer. Pull those down just a little bit. I have a tendency to make long legs. All right, so this week is going to be a lot about simplified anatomy and just getting our major, groupings of anatomical details in here and supporting our structure, but not becoming the focus of the sculpt. So one of the things I like to do, we'll just start with this torso here, is I'll keep my Dynamesh resolution very low as I work because it kind of is insurance for myself that I won't go too high. We want to make sure that we don't add any sort of resolution unnecessarily or too soon. And one of the ways you can kind of just force that is by keeping your Dynamesh resolution low and just only adding subdivision levels when you can no longer achieve the level of detail that you need to at your current subdivision level. You can also increase your Dynamesh resolution if you need to get just a little bit more detail, but for now we'll just stay as low as we can. And I'm going to start just with the move brush, pushing some of these shapes around until I start to get what I want. I think so. One thing that's nice is using Transpose Master to don't forget to turn on your symmetry. Okay, so using Transpose Master, I can elongate that torso just a little bit. It's feeling a little squat to me. Okay, clear that mask. One thing I am going to do, I'm pretty happy with the union of the legs and the body. So I'm going to Dynamesh those objects together too. Get out of Transpose Master and then combine the legs and the body by merging down. Oh, whoops, I did the arms and the leg. I'll go ahead and split those out again. All right, so merge those things down and then go into my Dynamesh options and let's just run Dynamesh. Okay, that looks a little bit low for me just because I know I'm going to be adding a little bit more detail this week. So I'm going to up that resolution and then just tap your model and run Dynamesh again. That's not working. Just do a little smooth, run Dynamesh again. All right, that worked. So sometimes you need to go touch the model a little bit before Dynamesh kind of wakes up and kicks in. But now I can smooth all this stuff. Oh, whoops. Okay, I see what's going on. So I still have Dynamesh obeying the groups, it looks like, or it's not Dynameshing at all. All right, let's try that again. So, oh, weird. Okay, so somehow I still had arms in here. I'm gonna go back and undo that. So you'll see it kept the copy of the arms in here, even though I split them out. Sometimes I get that happening on ZBrush. I'm not really sure why. So let's split that again, just make sure that's totally gone. All right, now our Dynamesh should work just fine. So I'll run Dynamesh. That merges my legs and my body. I'll keep the polygroups for now in case I need to quickly select one leg or something like that. Now I can just go and smooth out that union a little bit. Cool. Yeah, just clean up some of the jaggies that are left over from that very low res geometry that was in there. But I'm not going to worry about it too much because we'll be sculpting over all of this and touching every piece of the model today. All right, so back to what we were doing before. The reason I Dynamesh that stuff together is because I don't want to have to worry about working on two separate subtools right now with a very complex area like the hips. So sort of a good way to start, I think, is by going through and just defining some plane breaks and some skeletal landmarks, bony structures and stuff like that to sort of help you map out your character. So I'm going to change my material to something that's a little easier to see those changes on. So like going through and just really putting in that center line to start. Using like a Mech Cut brush or the Damn Standard brush or something like that. Where is the ridge of that rib cage? And that is going to be a major landmark for me, not only because it's so prevalent in the drawing, but because it's, like we discussed before, there's a break in the form there, so it changes the whole direction of the form there. So we're making sure that all of our plane changes and changes in the way that the form flows are dictated by these sort of major plane breaks. I'm just going to pull this back a little bit. I'm going to be wearing a shirt, so there'll be some compression in the chest and stuff. Not too worried about that at this point. I just want to kind of get the style right. And we're never going to see any of this kind of anatomy stuff that I'm putting in here, but it's very helpful for me as I'm sculpting to get that stuff because it helps me check on proportion to some degree and just kind of make sure that the character is feeling appropriate or capable of, doing what I need. Just building up some of that anatomy. And it's important, to kind of check yourself as you go because you don't want this to become a anatomy study. It's very easy for that to happen. Like I've got my anatomical reference up on one monitor while I'm going, so I'm constantly checking what I'm doing to make sure that I'm, not just inventing anatomy as I go, but I also want to make sure that I'm not getting too wrapped up in all of the detail because a couple of reasons. We're never going to see it, for one thing, so it'd be just a waste of effort. And also because I want to make sure that I maintain that sort of simplistic style that I have going in the concept art. And, one of the ways that we can make the style come across as believable in 3D is by, having a good grasp of the real world anatomy that this character would have, and then finding a way to simplify. So that's the key definitely for this week. I'm just gonna hit quick save. So yeah, the key for this week definitely is being able to find the simplicity wherever possible in your sculpt as you go along. So the first step, like I'm doing right now, is just kind of blocking out or really committing, I should say, committing to major plane breaks and form changes. And then even though we already kind of did an exploration of, where these forms should break up, like the apex of this thigh curve right there being not exactly in the center of this thigh. And then also having a relationship with the back of the leg and butt so that we get, nothing is totally parallel across. It just keeps both sides interesting. I want to make sure that I'm keeping all of that stuff in mind as I go this week. And then checking your forms, rotating around. I always sculpt a little bit and then rotate around to see, if I just imagine that there's a strong line that sort of blocks off this whole leg as it slots up into the torso. As I rotate around this model, I want to make sure that that line reads nicely and that the interior lines that we've got going on have some sort of a relationship with that exterior line, that silhouette as we rotate around. So there's this nice handoff. I mean, it's not nice yet, but there's going to be this nice handoff of the curvature of form as it's described with this break, this line that runs all the way through the body and becomes seamlessly an exterior line. Hopefully you can understand what I'm saying there. Definitely make sure that you're checking your profiles wherever you can. And then, what's a way that you can simplify those profiles? So like maybe this is feeling a little bumpy to me right now because I kind of went in and over sculpted that oblique a little bit. So if I just back that off, maybe build this up, something like that, I can reduce the amount of bumpiness or silhouette complexity that I'm getting in those areas. So I like to use the Damn Standard brush on a pretty low intensity to go through and just like carve out separations in form. So that's where my butt's just going to slot into the top of the leg there. One of the things I'm going to talk about a lot this week too, or you'll hear me say a couple times at least, is talking about that the way that shapes are slotting into each other. We want to make sure that nothing feels like it's just stacked on top of each other from top to bottom. I want to make sure that this leg feels like it's really, inserting down into this lower leg, and this lower leg is shaped, to receive that, and that there's, a complex. It's not just like a seam right here where there's an upper leg sitting on top of a lower leg. So by doing, and that's true to life too, right? If we look at some reference for that, these muscles all sort of are pulled across the knee area, and there's definitely a nice overlap and interlocking of anatomical detail. So before I go too far on these legs, let me show you a breakdown of a leg and kind of get you thinking the way that I am when I go to approach sculpting a whole leg. So let's take a look at that real quick. So here I did a couple of just really simple drawings to illustrate what I'm going to try to achieve with these legs. And it's all, overdrawn and exaggerated quite a bit. But so if we just start over on the left, there's a very, very simple outline of a leg. So I really tried to pay attention to straight on the inside, curve on the outside, make those curves as interesting as they can be. And, so I've got a complex and a simple side. It's very, very straightforward and simple, but it's indicative of the sort of feel of that leg shape that I'm going for. It reads as a leg. And then the next drawing over, I've added a little bit more detail, really paying attention to sort of the overlap of those silhouette and interior lines. If you look at the way that sort of hamstring line comes down and becomes that break point of the knee on the inside, and then goes back into the leg, sort of picks up with the shin bone, and then sweeps back down to the ankle. And then there's the drawing in blue and right there in the middle, where I've just gone and taken that second drawing and added a little bit more flesh to it, maybe paid a little bit more attention to the straights and the curves, and sort of brought it into a more realized space. And then I've got the profile drawings on the side there. That was just kind of helpful for me to plot out, where's the handoff of silhouette lines to interior lines? Where's that going to happen? Legs are always challenging for me because I have to look up how they work. That knee area gets very complex. And it's something I find myself studying a lot every time I sculpt any leg. Trying to find a good way to simplify that. So that's what these drawings sort of help me figure out as I go. All right, so let's jump back over to the model now. Right, so using those drawings as a guide, I feel a little bit, better prepared to go through and detail out these legs some. So I'm just going to work on one leg for now. So I like to hide that other stuff. And just like the progression of those drawings, I find that it can be really useful to just go in with like a standard brush or something and pull out those major breaks. That standard brush a little bit more power. Where's the break of that like bony part of the knee where the femur comes down and sort of protrudes on the inside there. That nice breakup on the inside of the leg. So maybe using something like Dam Standard or any kind of mech brush is really handy. And just place my breaks, basically, or use it to plot out where the overlap, just like in that drawing, we've got that line comes down like this, becomes the knee, and then sweeps back through all the way. It's a nice S curve that goes all the way through the whole leg. So I like to go through the whole form from top to bottom and really carve in and commit to some plane breaks and changes, sort of the second level of the sketch. So just using simple tools at this point. I still want to get my overall taper to my leg, but just really carve in some of these form changes, specifically the plane breaks. Just get that stuff resolved now. Another thing that I'm always paying attention to the way exterior and interior lines meet up. This is kind of an important one. This line that comes off the bottom of the kneecap here and then turns into one of the muscles of the quads. So from this angle, I want to see that kind of come through like this, meet, and then, like pick up on the inside. So I'll definitely find a way to exaggerate that, something like that. See how that line just becomes an exterior line? That's the kind of stuff I'm looking for. It tends to read real nice in 3D. So let's work on the overlap of these forms, the slotting of the upper and lower leg. So one really apparent place for that is the back of the knee here. There's sort of this nice nice duality. On the back we have the lower leg going up into the upper leg, and on the front we've got that upper leg coming down and into the lower leg, and then this kind of nice, almost like a puzzle piece sticking together. So go through and kind of just overemphasize that stuff for yourself. There's a secondary break right here on the back of the knee. So where's that break? Just carve it in. And then, if you do this enough, you will start to kind of do it automatically as you sculpt. As you work on characters in the future, it'll be second nature. And this is just the kind of, it's good to keep this stuff in mind. All the principles, the fundamentals that we talk about in week 1, nice to keep in mind while you're sculpting, but especially important for designing in 3D if you do that. And as 3D modelers, as I brought up before, part of our job is to do some amount of design in 3D, because no drawing is going to tell you all of the information that you need to know. So there's a good amount of work or knowledge that you'll have to apply yourself. Get a nice over-exaggerated curviness S shape to that. I want to go too off the rails with the wavy lines. I feel pretty good about where most of my breaks are. Maybe add something there, just so I know that's where that hit is in that form. That place where this form changes direction. I might lower this. So look at your silhouette. Make sure that you don't have, if I look at this area from where the leg connects to the torso down to where it connects to the knee, I want to make sure that this indentation isn't just dead center, which it sort of is right now. So I'm just going to sculpt that out, kind of bring it back in just a little lower than it was. And so what you should be getting is, we've got the overall taper that the whole leg has, but then we get this really sort of nice flow of these interconnected forms all the way down through the leg too. And then we get to ruin all of that when we go and pose this. Now, actually, a lot of this will maintain and show up in the pose, especially on this character. It's got a fairly straight-legged pose. So once I've got all my plane breaks in and I'm kind of happy with them, everything constantly changes and evolves. Remember that everything looks bad until it doesn't. But it's time to start going and just kind of filling in those areas. I don't want it to feel too mechanical and overly stylized, but I also want to make sure I'm not getting into anatomy study territory. So remember that. Just want to make sure that this line is reading. Before I started sculpting this leg, I went and looked at a lot of Bill Pressing drawings for the way that he does his leg, specifically the way that he sort of connects the back of the leg together with the upper leg. And it's just really nice, elegant flow of lines. So yeah, using other artists that you like for reference. If you've seen, anytime I come across something, a particular way that I like that's been handled by some artist, I like to save that for future reference, because it really comes into play. So, I'm getting a little bit kind of wavy. It's a lot of like little indentations and bumps and stuff on this leg. So just go through and evening that stuff out with a large move brush, keeping everything as simple as possible, especially this early on. And then once I've got a fairly decent kind of first pass at the whole leg, then I can go back in and do a more detailed pass and get all the sort of extra details and stuff that I missed the first time. So, working in stages. Also, normally I might do a whole character this way. I might go through and sort of block out all the shapes for an entire character first, and then go and add all the detail and not jump around, or actually would jump around a lot more than I'm doing here. But for the way that this class is structured, it makes a lot more sense to go in and do each little piece separately. It's kind of a good way to stay focused too. So I'm not too interested in the foot this week, speaking of, but I do want to make sure that my overlap is feeling good, that this leg is coming down and it feels like it's connected like an action figure into that foot. Get those plane breaks in there and then go back in and soften it up a little bit. Ankles aren't super important on her because we'll never see them, but some of your characters might have ankles, so I will sculpt some ankles. Just remember, there's a balance of inside and outside, so that interior ankle is always a little higher up than the exterior ankle, just very slightly. Never make your forms parallel. If you do anything, make sure that you rid yourself of parallel lines. Avoid parallels at all costs, unless it serves the design. Of course, there's always exceptions to every rule. Some designs benefit from having that look, but in general, you want to avoid it. Okay, so I've got some elements like this line that are feeling a little bit too carved in. Yeah, so soften out some of those transitions, but make sure, if I look at the highlight on this matte cap, it tells me where the raised edges are. So I'm keeping that shape still very much in there, but just softening some of that stuff. Starts to feel a little bit mechanical or off model for this drawing. Sometimes if a form isn't looking right to you in 3D and you can't quite figure it out, don't forget you always have the option of cross-sectioning something and being able to see it. Take a look at this silhouette that I get when I cross-section this leg, and then you can grow your selection up or down so that you can get just all the way through, like a CAT scan or whatever those kind of medical scanners that cross-section everything are. You can really get a good feel for what the curvature of that shape is doing. So if you look at the calf, this is getting kind of a little bit triangular. It looks a little flat here on the back. I would like to round that out some more. So by doing that cross section or looking at it from an extreme angle like this, I can get a better feel for that. So do that often. I work inside the model quite a bit too, which I'll show you here in a minute. Just pull that calf out. She's got some big calves. This is also feeling now a little bit too sharp. So playing with that silhouette, kind of soften that out some. There's a nice, notice I use the move brush a lot at this stage, and actually more than any other brush in general. All right. Anytime I do use a sculpting brush, I try to use it on a fairly low setting and just sort of gradually build up those changes as I go instead of just blasting. It's all about subtlety. Subtlety in the way that these shapes are handled. What am I going to do with this knee? I think I want a more definite creasing there. Just kind of follow that all the way around. Just connect that shape. And then use move to fix the wonkiness. So I like that there's like a straight on the top plane of that knee, and then it turns into that curve, and then down into the straight of the shin. Just going to kind of hint at this quad muscle in here by making the break of the knee into the leg just a little bit more apparent. Something like that. Sculpting in anatomical detail here and there, and then just backing it way off, smoothing it out. It leaves that structure in, so we'll still get a read on that, which is nice. But we don't want to get too, depending on how stylized your design is that you're working from, you don't want to get too realistic unnecessarily, but definitely injecting some of that anatomy in there is really helpful. So we're getting a little bit lost on the knees back here. I'm going to check this other model that I did. Comparison. Okay, so that one's real soft. Thicken up the whole knee a little bit. I'm not getting the feeling of really strong interlocking shapes on that knee yet, but I will get there. So I want to simplify that interlocking connection line. Just make sure that it's not getting too wavy at any one point. It's feeling a little nicer. Just really add some volume to this lower leg. She's got some huge, huge calves. So here's a good example of edge quality that I want to control. So if I've got this line that comes down, it's kind of a hard crease, and then it gets to a certain point, I don't want to just stop it right there. So I'll continue that hard crease down so it kind of connects over to the shin, and then just smooth out, kind of control the smoothness as it transitions from a hard edge, and starts to dissipate and fade into this lower leg. All right, it's feeling pretty good. Go and sharpen up a couple areas here. Nice clean knee. I'm gonna just do a smooth pass on this upper leg here. Whoops, I just totally ruined the whole model. No problem. Just make sure you periodically ruin everything that you're working on. Get some more curvature on either side of the break of where that sort of simulated great trochanter bulge is. I'm just going around kind of cleaning up some of my surface. Probably unnecessary at this point. So we're going to be adding more detail and dynameshing, and all that stuff will get cleaned up anyway. Alright, so let's move on up into where this leg sockets into the body, which we already worked on a little bit. But I want to show you one thing real quick that I find is a handy tool. Let's just complete the line. So, again, controlling that transition of sharp edge to soft edge. And then just look at that from all angles. Even though we're not going to see it, it's still helpful to make sure that your structure is working for you in there. I'm just going to sharpen up this crease. Sharpen and simplify. So if we look at a comparison of where our knee was and where it is now, the specificity of some of the stuff that we're doing in there, we still have the same overall look for that knee, but some of that attention to detailing is really helping this feel more cohesive. I'm going to come back and hit this knee again once I go and work on some other parts. I think it helps to jump around and revisit stuff, but for now that's feeling pretty good to me. So let's go ahead and apply that to both sides. Doing a smart resim. Boink. There we go. And there's probably something that needs to be cleaned up. You know, Smart Resim, very fickle if you don't have your mask quite right. So I'm going to undo that. And instead of doing that, I'm going to do a mirror and weld. Since this is only one subdivision level, I don't really care about, maintaining any of that. And it's symmetrical anyway. So mirror and weld, which you can see puts a perfect center line. Now my topology is symmetrical, which doesn't matter for Dynamesh, but there we go. Now I can work with symmetry back on. And nice, it also mirrored over this weird geometry artifacting that I didn't want, but it doesn't matter. So one more thing I want to show you about just this area where the sort of the crotch area where the legs connect into the torso, and that is just a trick that I like to use where I will kind of cut off the outside of the leg, and then this is something we use all the time when we have to make a character that's got to move, but it's also very important for stationary characters or characters that you're going to have to pose. And that's just making sure that this line, that center line, is a clean shape that makes sense. So I like to clean that up a little bit and kind of maintain the overall jelly bean shape of the torso. It's sort of like those anatomy cutaways from school. All right, so I'm just going to go around the torso now and continue kind of what I did. I was working on mainly the lower torso before. So now I'll go ahead and hit this upper torso. So just like with everywhere else, it's important to, first of all, go in and establish as much as you can. Some bony landmarks are always very helpful. If I bring my arms back in here, I want to drop these clavicles just a little bit, just to make sure that that clavicle is going pretty straight across, or even up a little bit. I was feeling like it was going the other way. Pull these forward some. All right, so only some of this will be visible when she gets her shirt on. So I'm not gonna go too crazy. Sculpting perfectly shaped breasts or anything on the torso here. Think about how much stuff is actually going to be shown in your final model when you go to render this or print it or whatever. And save yourself some time by not fully realizing that stuff. But it's still handy to have some idea in there because we're going to have to fit a shirt onto this body. So it's nice to know. So here I'm just carving away, separating major, pieces. And then this is something I see happen all the time. So I've carved this line here, and I want that there. But do you see how distorted and kind of weird that's making the other structure here, this other form? So the torso, right, is this big bean shape here, and everything else just kind of sits on top of that. So I want to make sure that my curvature, is feeling nice on that torso. So I'll just go around and sort of correct that where I see it so that my interior and exterior lines have a better relationship. It really cleans up a lot. You see how I'm sculpting by looking at where the silhouette intersects across and becomes an interior line. And then just cleaning that stuff up for a much cleaner read on these forms, these shapes. Okay. So this silhouette too, getting a little bit blocky or noodly, I should say. Too much detail. So simplifying that, or at least committing to what's really going on. You know, we've got that shape of her rib cage that's in there. And then we've got, you know, if this was on the back, we've got those back muscles that sort of overlap at a certain point, and we start to see the trap, or whatever that is. Not an anatomy class. So there's a nice interplay there. She's got a really wide. So this kind of stuff, you know, I'll polish it up, I'll finish it up to a certain degree, but I don't care about, you know, really getting in and doing a lot of detail work on the back here because we're never going to see it. And, you know, this amount of information gives me what I need. It's a, you know, simplified pass at some anatomical structure, just enough to help me do the posing and stuff like that. And I've managed to turn off symmetry. I'm just going to do another mirror and weld. Wrong side though, so first thing, mirror it, and then do mirror and weld. And I don't like this waviness. This feels off to me, so I'm going to widen these hips some. Pull this out. Sculpt up that area. Alright, feels a little better. So, nothing down here is perfect anatomy, but it is adequate for our needs for this class. So I'll just go around and clean up the curvature here. If you're working on a male character, you know, I do the exact same thing, obviously, with any sort of visible pecs or anything that are on your male character or female character that has visible pecs too. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good about this. I like the way that all of these things feel slotted into each other. You know, there's this overall form that's doing this, and then I've got this area that's receiving that. You know, it's just all of that stuff is nicely interconnected. And we've got these nice silhouettes that turn into interior forms that continue and back into silhouette. Hopefully all over the whole body. So kind of maybe a little too gung-ho on that center line. I don't imagine that she's extremely cut. There's got to be a layer of fat on there too. I'm playing with that ridge of, you know, where that pelvic ridge is. Because who knows? Like I say, imagine this is a statue, but it's also imagine this is a character for animation. This is your sculpting your proof of concept for this design to go into an animated film or something like that. And you know, at some point, maybe there's a costume change or something, and she's, you know, your character's got their swimsuit on or something like that. So we're gonna see all that. It's nice to be able to predict some of that stuff. I guarantee you, if you ever get a chance to work in a production environment and someone tells you we won't see some part of the body, you can be guaranteed that you'll see part of the body. This is an area, this is a good example of why working inside the model sometimes is really beneficial. So if I use my mech brush and kind of do this separation or this creasing, actually worked pretty well, but sometimes it has a tendency to sort of screw up, you know, the curvature that's on either side of that. So if I just undo that a little bit and go inside the model and work, we can still see just how soft that is. But if we do our cut this way, our pinch or our sharpen, it doesn't really screw up, you know, your curvature, hopefully. Worth a shot. In this case, I actually like this one better. In this case, I actually like what it did for me there. So I just sharpen that stuff. And, you know, just make a commitment to the shapes that you're sculpting. don't leave anything undecided. Don't leave anything up to, you know, unfinished looking, or make sure that there's no doubt about what you're intending with everything that you're sculpting. That's kind of the most important thing I can say about this week. If something looks unresolved or possibly like a mistake, then you're probably not doing enough research. You should be looking up anatomy and doing some drawovers if you need to really get the feel of everything. So there's still a lot of work that could go into all of this stuff, obviously, and I'll, like I said, revisit each of these pieces as I go back and do kind of like a final sculpt on this body. But for now, let's move on to the arms. Okay, welcome back. So let's get started on the arms. So the blockout for this arm is actually pretty decent already, which is nice. You know, being able to get as far as you can with your blockout is definitely going to save you a lot of guesswork later. So I like the way that the elbows and stuff are looking. We can kind of plus that up some because it does feel a little bit anatomy study-ish, a little bit uncommitted to some of this waviness, stuff like that. So let's go through and do some work on that. So remember, I've got 2 sets of arms for whatever reason. I can delete one of those and just make sure I don't have a hidden body in here. Okay, let's re-dynamesh these arms for now. Yeah, with a little bit higher resolution. Dynamesh. That work? Tap it, run it again, sculpt, run it. Yeah. So just hit the smooth on there once and then rerun your Dynamesh. Make sure that that's working. So just like with the legs, I'm going to go through first and plane out all of my major form breaks, line breaks and stuff. And then I'll go back in and figure out the appropriate level of fleshiness or anatomy, musculature that should go into that. It's all the same stuff. Just going through, making sure everything interlocks, everything is connected and overlapping and set into each other nicely. And then simplifying anatomy. Did I say that yet? All right, so let's take a look at what we did on these arms. So first and foremost, what I wanted to do is just like the leg, make sure that these pieces, kind of slot into each other in a way that's pleasing. And we get a lot of good exterior silhouette lines coming down, becoming interior lines, and then back out to exterior. So, look for those S curves wherever you can, and then make sure that that same shape is reading as you rotate around the model. Also going through and making sure that, the apex of the break in the forearm right there from wrist to elbow is, not perfectly centered. It's high up. And then on the inside of the arm, we've got that other apex that's a little bit lower down. So it creates a nice diagonal. So same thing with the bicep. We've got the apex of the tricep back here, and then the apex of the bicep in the front. So nothing is mirrored, and we get a nice, diagonal shape or thrust happening there. So there's still some stuff I could do on these arms, but I feel like that's a fairly decent first pass of getting my shapes and stuff in there. I'm not getting too anatomical or too detailed. I might actually go in and sort of back some of this off some on my second pass of this model. But yeah, I think that feels pretty good for now. So I'm ready to integrate these into the body. I'm ready to put these arms into the body now, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that. So I want to talk about how we're going to tie all of these pieces together to make one cohesive mesh, one cohesive unit. So, I previously had all my pieces kind of broken up. I like to be able to work on them individually at any kind of resolution that I need. So it's handy to have them as, multiple subtools. But the body, we're going to treat as one subtool going forward. Kind of as we complete each piece of this character, we'll just merge it in. There's a real advantage to using multiple subdivisions, obviously, in ZBrush. So for everything that we've accomplished so far, there's no reason to have more than one subdivision level, really, because we're mostly just experimenting with the form and the shape. But now it's nice to have that extra level of control. So anytime that we divide in ZBrush, we want to not use that to add detail, but use it to control the amount of detail that you're showing. So that's the way I want you to think about adding subdivision levels. So I'm going to show you now how I like to connect objects together and maintain all of the clarity and detail that I have so far, but get the added bonus of having a couple different subdivision levels to work on. So the first thing I'm going to do is, save this just in case something goes catastrophically wrong. And then I'm going to duplicate my arms and my body and just hide those. Okay, so I've got hidden arms and body, and I've got these ones. I'm going to hide my hands and my head just to keep everything as simple as possible. All right, so let's go ahead and combine these. So I'm going to go ahead over here and merge down. So now my body and my arms are one object, but they're interpenetrating Dynamesh geometry. So what I'll do is go ahead and Dynamesh this whole thing. I'm going to keep the same resolution. Let's see what that gives me. Dynamesh it together just so that I can get, that union, that whole, clear out all the interior geometry. And then I'm going to, that actually maintained a lot of that resolution, which is good. So I'll clean up around these areas real quick, just kind of fast and loose. And then sculpt out some of that transition, just control that a little better. Now that we're one object, we can easily manage those transitional areas. Get some scapula action in here that we were missing before. And this is another nice area that we can go in and work on the interior a little bit, work from the inside out. So just go in with my pinch. Just go in with my pinch or mech brush. Just really crease that angle a little bit, and then just look at what the shape of that hole is doing, and control that a little easier. All right, we're definitely going to revisit all of this. I'm not too worried about getting it totally perfect at this point or ever because she's wearing a shirt. But I can get a little bit more of that anatomy blocked in there, roughed in. Helpful when we start to move stuff. All right, that's good enough for now. And then make sure to mirror and weld so that we get all of the work that we did over here. All right, so now we've got symmetrical geometry. So what I'm going to do now is duplicate this object, and then on the new mesh, you see I can keep working on this sculpt, but it's Dynamesh, so it's very, high resolution. Actually, not as high as it could be but there's a chance some of you, I'm sure, will have a much higher resolution. I tend to work very low for as long as possible, but typically you'll have a Dynamesh that's very high resolution, and it gets to the point where it becomes more difficult to work with. Like if I needed to be able to move these arms or something like that, trying to use topological masking on the Dynamesh is a disaster. So we want to get an underlying structure and topology to support those sort of bigger moves. That's really going to become imperative when we get to posing. So the first thing I'll do is we're just going to kind of get something that works for us and then not worry too much about it. If you have a base mesh or a topology somewhere that you really like the flow of, the layout, by all means use that. For this right now, I'm just going to do a quick Z-remesh. So without changing any of the default settings, I'm just going to run it and see what we get. All right. So obviously, yeah, we blast all of our detail out, but we get a low-res mesh. It's easy to topological mask. It supports most of that major form. So that's nice. We'll say, I never liked the way that Z-remesher does this transition of chest into shoulder, but actually that's not too bad. This time did a pretty good job. Oh, one interesting thing to note, it's not symmetrical, and that's because I don't have X symmetry turned on. So I'm going to undo that and run Z-remesher again with my X symmetry turned on. Nice. So that's actually much nicer. Yeah, I really like these kinds of areas are what I'm looking for, that transition between the arms and the shoulders and the hips and stuff, because when we go to move that stuff, it should be as tube-like as possible, and that's perfect actually. It's very nice for what we need. So let's go ahead and keep that. And what I'm going to do is give this mesh a couple subdivision levels. So now I've got 3 levels. So I'm going to just now project this new mesh on top of the old Dynamesh body. So go to your project, and let's just go ahead and do that. Project all, isolate it, and let's inspect it real quick. So this is our new, good topology, we'll say, and then beneath it, I've got our Dynamesh. So if I just isolate the Dynamesh and then toggle up and down in my tool stack there, I'm really not losing a lot of detail. So that's working pretty well for me. And I can add another layer or another subdivision level if I want to do stuff like clean up these jaggies. I'm not too worried about those for right now. So what's nice about this workflow is you can jump back and forth, if I needed to add the hands in, or if I needed to add some extra legs or something sticking onto the side of this, I can do that, Dynamesh the whole thing together, and as long as you keep your detail level mesh as a separate object, you can always reproject that back onto here. Okay, so you really can't go wrong in ZBrush anymore. There's no real way to permanently screw up your model or anything like that. You can always save yourself by going back to Dynamesh, making any kind of changes to the volume or structure that you need to, and then back into Z-remesher to get yourself a more useful mesh that's got subdivision levels on it. Yay! So I'm just going to clean up my scene a little bit here. I've got this file saved, so I can delete out some of this old stuff that I don't need anymore. And we'll bring everything back like the head and the hands, and we're ready to keep going. So now I'm going to do I'm just going to keep sculpting on this a little bit. There's a few things I want to clean up, like some of these transitions, and the level of anatomy in some of these areas is kind of inconsistent overall. So I'm just going to go and do one more quick pass on this model to sort of call it done for now. I mean, I'm always going to go back and change stuff, but I know that this character is going to change quite a bit when we get her into pose. So I don't want to do too much work now and then have to redo that stuff later. But I think one more sculpting pass on this model will be good. And then we'll be ready to move on to the face. All right, so here we are after about another 20, maybe 30 minutes of sculpting and just going around this model and making sure that, things like my exterior silhouette lines are, blending over nicely with my interior lines, that nothing looks strange to me as I'm rotating it around from different angles, and that I've simplified my anatomy to a degree that feels right for the concept that I'm working from. If anything, it's probably a little bit much right now, and it's something that I'll have to choose if I want to back it off some more when I get this character into pose. And, remember, we're going to be adding color and stuff to this, so all of that has some sort of an impact. I find it's easier to go a little too far with some of the detail and then dial it back later, rather than go into it with the whole body being sort of under sculpted. So, like I had mentioned before, I'm going to be revisiting all of these pieces, especially as I get it into pose, and the composition of my pose becomes more important. So, this is definitely at a good level for me now, where I can, do topological masking that's really reliable for posing, because I've got that good underlying support structure from the Z remesher. And yeah, so I'm ready to go. And I haven't, added too much detail in areas that I won't see. So, underneath all of this clothing and stuff, I have just enough information to help me find these landmarks and then associate them with the drawing. But, don't waste your time with a lot of unnecessary anatomy study and stuff like that. Hey, so I want to cover one last technique this week, and that is using existing good topology for your structured mesh instead of a Z-remesher object. So if you've got, a good, maybe you worked on another character before and already sorted out a lot of these topological issues, it is oftentimes nice to have good underlying structure for your sculpt, even if you're never going to be modeling this for animation or anything like that. So here I've got another topology that I used on an older character that was for animation. And now I'm just overlaying that with the move brush just very broadly on top of my Dynamesh sculpt. I'm being very loose with all of the sort of positioning and just kind of getting major landmarks set where they should go, and then working in X-ray mode just to kind of double check myself. But just work very quickly and pull that new topology around on top of your sculpt. Get everything kind of lined up as best you can. And then once everything is kind of in place, like for example, I'm not ready to project the detail from the head yet or the hands. I don't want to ruin that topology yet because I haven't sculpted those areas. So I'll mask those off, or in this example, I'll just make the hands and the head one polygroup that's easily hidden, and then just do a project all for my newly aligned topology. And, again, I'm going to sculpt on top of this, so I'm not too worried about exact span placement. It's just getting some of that really specific landmark areas to support the sculpt. And that's going to make things a whole heck of a lot easier when it comes time to pose this character, or even just to do some basic sculpting. It's always good to have a strong structure underneath your sculpt as you're going. So, if Z Remesher isn't giving you a good flow or something that, works well for your particular workflow, then, it's fine to do a retopology or to just, borrow another model's topology to overlay. And then from here, I'll just add subdivision levels like I normally would, but I've always got a nice, strong foundation underneath. So yeah, if you don't already have that, it's fine. You can just go with your Z remesher result, or even just do a retopology at this point if you feel inclined. But This is just always a really helpful way to work, I think. And once you have a good topology for a human, then you can reuse that on all kinds of projects. So here I accidentally blasted the face and the hands apart, but that's no big deal because I can just go back and cut those off or whatever I need to do because I have not yet sculpted those areas. So here we go, nice clean topology with all of my details projected on top. And we're ready to move on to the head and hands. A quick comparison of what ZeroMesher gave me versus my other topology. Yay! All right, so let's talk about the homework for this week and where I ended up with my model. So the whole point of this week was finding how to ground your model's design in reality by, figuring out how best to stylize the anatomy and keep all of those major plane breaks and proportions, that you had in your initial blockout, and if anything, improve them as you go. So you don't have to have a completely finished sculpt at this point, but your sculpt should be well on its way towards completion, and at the very least, very useful to you as you move forward. We're going to finish out all of the different body pieces to about this level of polish, and you should have, a couple subdivision levels that allow you to control the amount of detail that you want to show, and also that are going to support when you start to pose this object. You know, um, I don't ever sculpt in a way where I totally finish the body or totally finish the hands and then move on to the next piece and then totally finish that thing off. I think it makes sense to jump around and you sculpt all different pieces of the body and face and hands and all of that stuff at once. Um, but the way that we're kind of going through this is to keep us focused on one specific thing at a time, and then at each successive stage of that, we'll go back and look at the whole character as a whole and make sure that everything is still working well. So this week, get your character to about this level, and just know that things are going to change and become better and get modified as we start to pose this character, add accessories, and all that kind of stuff. So don't spend too much time on anything that we're not going to see, and just sort of have an indication of that structure underneath clothing and things like that, because it really does help and comes into play when we start to move stuff around, and it's great practice. All right, so good luck this week, and I'll see you next week when we start the face. Thanks.